it is important to be clear that the Ombudsman was not looking at these policy changes to the state pension age. But between 2018 and 2024, the Ombudsman investigated complaints from 1950s-born women into the communication of changes to the state pension age. In March last year, following a lengthy investigation lasting 6 years, the Ombudsman published their final report. In December of last year, the then Work and Pensions Secretary, my Right Honourable friend, the member for Leicester West, provided the government's response to the House. In coming to this decision, my Right Honourable friend gave the Ombudsman's report full consideration and looked in detail at the findings, reviewing all the information and advice provided to her at the time by the DWP. My Right Honourable friend did her job thoroughly and professionally in weighing up all the information before her and then coming to a conclusion and informing Parliament. Since then, as part of the legal proceedings challenging the government's decision, evidence has been cited about research findings from a 2007 report. This was a DWP evaluation of the effectiveness of automatic pension forecast letters. Had this report been provided to my Right Honourable friend, she would of course have considered it alongside all other relevant evidence and material. Mr. Speaker, in light of this, and in the interests of fairness and transparency, I have concluded that the government should now consider this evidence. This means we will retake the decision made last December as it relates to the communications on state pension age. As the House will be aware, the decision announced last December has been the subject of court action in recent months, and we have today informed the court of the action we now intend to take. In retaking the decision, we will review the evidence from 2007 alongside evidence previously considered. And I have, of course, asked the Department if there is any further survey material or other evidence which should be brought to my attention as part of this process. I understand that people are impatient for this matter to be finally resolved, with the Ombudsman's investigation having taken 6 years before reporting last year. But it is important that we give this full and proper consideration. We will approach this in a transparent and fair manner. However, retaking this decision should not be taken as an indication that government will necessarily decide that it should award financial redress. The work will begin immediately, and I will update the House on the decision as soon as a conclusion is reached. Mr. Speaker, I do understand that honourable and right honourable members will have a number of questions, but I hope that you and the House will also understand that I cannot say anything today which preempts the conclusion of the process that I have set out. Mr. Speaker, I commend this statement to the House.
Senator Minister Mark Maloney.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement. As he so rightly says, this is an important, albeit technical statement, and we on this side certainly accept the contents and the spirit in which it's given. It is about a legal process, and we respect all of that. It does relate to a matter of keen interest to many of our constituents, those women who have, as the Minister said, been affected by the changes in retirement age. And known as WASPI, the campaign group Women Against State Pension Inequality has probably met with all of us here in this chamber one way or another. And they will be looking at the point made, I think, by the Secretary of State late in his statement that, and I quote, retaking this decision should not be taken as an indication that government will necessarily decide to award financial redress. Mr. Speaker, the WASPI women are rightly angry with this government. While in opposition, shadow ministers and Labour MPs stood alongside these women, as the Right Honourable Gentleman did, campaigning for, and I quote, a better deal for WASPI women. However, when the party opposite won the general election, they quickly apparently U-turned on this position, blaming the fiscal situation they were left with. Indeed, in December last year, the government made a statement confirming their about-turn on supporting WASPy women. If I may, Mr. Speaker, I would like to quote my honourable friend, the Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, when she responded to that statement. She said, and I quote, "Let us be clear. The decision to provide no compensation is the government's decision and they need to own it. I am not going to let them get away with saying that there is no compensation because of a fictional black hole in the public finances. Government compensation should always be based on what is fair and what is just." And she is absolutely right, Mr. Speaker. The government had the choice then to stand behind the women that they said have faced a great injustice, but they chose not to. What we have instead is the Labour Party now fighting them in a judicial review in the High Court. And therefore, whether it be the multiple U-turns on pension and winter fuel statements or the imminent rumoured freezing on the tax threshold in the budget, forcing many pensioners into paying income tax, it is clear this government is not on the side of our pensioners. And this brings me to some questions for the Secretary of State. Firstly, if I may, the Minister for Pensions said in a Westminster Hall debate on the 15th of January on this topic that, and I quote, "We will work with the Ombudsman to develop a detailed action plan identifying and addressing lessons from this and other Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman's investigations. However, to my knowledge, nothing has been released to this effect. Therefore, could he provide an update on when we can expect the plan and what will be in it?" Secondly, in a follow-up to written parliamentary questions by the members for West Dunbartonshire and Newport West and Isleworth, the government said that they have no plans to meet with representatives of the WASPy campaign. Indeed, the last time a minister did meet them was on the 5th of September 2024. So why has this government decided not to directly engage with the group that they once stood shoulder to shoulder with, especially given there is new evidence to consider? Thirdly, during the last 14 years whilst in government, we chose to help pensioners by increasing the personal allowance income tax threshold. However, independent research suggests that 1.6 million more pensioners are doomed to be filling in self-assessment tax returns within the next 4 years, thanks to government's choices that may be made in the budget coming up. Has the Secretary of State had conversations with the Chancellor about the serious impact this retirement tax would have on a group that have been consistently targeted by this government? And finally, Mr. Speaker, why is this government determined to blame everyone else for the decisions they have made? All this statement has shown is that the government wants to keep kicking the can down the road and not be held accountable for their actions. And I think, Mr. Speaker, we should look at the record. Unemployment at 5% is at the highest level since the pandemic, up from 4.2% in June last year. Inflation is now sitting at 3.8%, up from 2% in June last year. Economic growth has flatlined despite having increased by 0.5% in the 3 months before this government took office. Borrowing costs have increased to their highest level since 1998, with 30-year gilt yields reaching 5.2% compared with 4.7% when the government took office. Debt is now 96.4% of GDP, the highest since the 1960s. Winter fuel payments will cut for millions of pensions, only for the government to U-turn on it after feeling the pressure of our strong campaign. The government is set to break its manifesto pledge and increase the tax burden to an historic high. Isn't it true, Mr. Speaker, that this government has been trying to dodge taking any form of responsibility for their actions? What is their problem with pensioners? Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to the honourable member for at least some of his response. I, of course, cannot preempt the conclusion of the process that I set out in my statement. I want to do this fairly and transparently. I do have to say to him, his own government had many, many years to consider this matter and did not come to a conclusion. Yeah. So I take it with a little pinch of salt when he urges us to go more quickly. He refers to pensioners. We, of course, said that we would maintain the triple lock. We have kept to that commitment, and that will mean an increase of some £1,900 a year in the basic state pension over the course of this Parliament. We remain committed to the publication of the action plan to which he referred, and he referred to the previous Minister for Pensions meeting the WASPy campaigners. He's right that she did so. He was a little more coy about the last time a Conservative minister met with the WASPy campaigners. Perhaps someone on that side could tell us when. I believe it was many, many years before that, and that our minister was the first one to meet the WASPy campaigners for some time. And finally, on the broader economic record, he failed to join me in welcoming the UK having the fastest growth in the G7 for the first half of this year.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank my right honourable friend for the statement, and I appreciate the technical nature of that. Clearly, it is a concern that this evidence wasn't made available to our right honourable friend, the member for Leicester West, last year, and I know he will be investigating that. And again, I appreciate he won't be able to give a specific date as to when he may be able to conclude what this evidence means for the final conclusions he comes to. But is he able to give a time frame on when he's able to report back to the House?
Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful to the Chair of the Select Committee for her question. I know that she's taken a long and keen interest in this matter. On the matter of timescale, I appreciate that the statement, when people hear it, they will want to know when the conclusion will be. I think it's right and proper that I look at all the available evidence. I said in my statement, I of course have asked the Department if there is any other survey evidence or other kind of evidence that should be brought to my attention. So with that proviso, I can assure her and you, Mr. Speaker, that I will come to a conclusion and report to the House as soon as possible.
The Democrat spokesperson, Steve Darling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd first of all like to apologise for inadvertently using the word you at the last time I spoke. So apologies, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. But clearly, the clock is ticking for WASPI women. There are 3.6 million WASPI women across the United Kingdom. That's 500,000 more than the population of Wales. And sadly, a WASPI woman dies every 13 minutes. So I welcome this statement from the Secretary of State. When we've explored this subject in recent months, what I found extremely disturbing was how the Ombudsman failed to engage with the previous Conservative government because they knew there wouldn't be a deal to be made around what the relevant approach would be as far as compensation for WASPI women. So I would plead with the Secretary of State to revisit that world. After all, they are on the record of supporting WASPI women for many years, and look to meet with them and ensure there is a fair deal. There is due to be a High Court hearing next month, and I would implore the Secretary of State to engage positively and bring this to a fair deal for WASPI women.
So State.
Can I thank the honourable member for his questions? He's right, this issue has gone on a long time, but I took the view that in light of this evidence being cited, that it was the right thing to do to look again at it and at the decision in the round. I cannot speak for the previous government's failure to engage with the Ombudsman. That's a matter for them, but I can tell him that this government is engaged with the Ombudsman on the action plan that was discussed earlier, and we will continue to do so. And as I said, Mr. Speaker, I will come to a conclusion and report to the House as soon as possible.
Final question, Kirsty Black.
Much, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State said as part of the legal proceedings challenging the government's decision, evidence has been cited about research findings from a 2007 report. Who cited that evidence? Was it DWP? Was it the government that cited that evidence, or was it the people who are opposing the government in the court case that cited the evidence? And if it came from government sources or from within DWP, why wasn't it uncovered before? And can the Minister give us every assurance that he's doing everything he can to ensure that all relevant evidence is uncovered in advance of the next decision being taken?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable lady asks about the nature of this evidence. It is a report from 2007. It's a DWP evaluation, as I said, and the survey was not drawn to the attention of the previous Secretary of State because its potential relevance to the making of her decision was not evident at the time. I will consider this survey and any other relevant evidence in the process to which I referred in my statement, Mr. Speaker.
I'm going to suspend the House till 17:15 because of the late notice of the next statement. House suspended.
Order, order. We now come to the statement. Secretary of State, Lisa Nandy.
With permission, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will make a statement about the BBC. As the House will be aware, this weekend the Director General and the Chief Executive Officer of News tendered their resignations following concerns about accuracy and impartiality at the BBC. This has sparked intense debate across the media and our nation, and today I want to set out for the House what action is being taken to address the allegations that have been made, the actions this government is taking to support the BBC to address this, and the future of an institution that has been at the centre of our democratic and cultural life for over a century. The House will know that yesterday the Chair of the BBC, Samir Shah, wrote to the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee. He accepted there had been editorial failings and committed to a number of steps in response. Dr Shah believes that our national broadcaster, which remains one of the most trusted sources of news in our country, has a responsibility to uphold the highest standards. I agree. Over the past week, I've been in regular contact with him and his team to ensure that where these standards have not been met, firm, swift and transparent action follows. I welcome the steps that have already been set out, and I will keep the House updated as the BBC leadership grips these issues. The concerns that have been raised are serious in and of themselves, but some in this House have gone even further, suggesting that the BBC is institutionally biased. It should not be lost on us that the BBC has faced criticism from all sides for its coverage of highly contentious and contested issues, and accused of giving too much airtime to particular parties and for giving them too little. Those in this House attacking the BBC from left and right for not expressing views they agree with should consider just what is at stake. There is a fundamental difference between raising serious concerns over editorial failings and members of this House launching a sustained attack on the institution itself. Because the BBC is not just a broadcaster, it is a national institution that belongs to us all. Every day it tells the story of who we are, the people, places and communities that make up life across the UK. It projects British values, creativity and integrity to the world. It underpins our creative industries, has a footprint in our nations and regions that is unmatched by any other, and it is by far the most widely used and trusted source of news in the United Kingdom. At a time when the lines are being dangerously blurred between fact and opinion, news and polemic, the BBC stands apart. It is a light on the hill for people here and across the world. Trusted news and high-quality programming is essential to our democratic and cultural life. All of us in this House should value it, uphold it and fiercely defend it. The BBC is facing challenges, some of its own making, but it is doing so in the context of a revolution in the media landscape that has challenged all broadcasters and polarised and fragmented our national debate. It is time to grip this with a clarity of vision and purpose that secures the BBC's future. Throughout its history, Madam Deputy Speaker, the BBC has always adapted and evolved. This is an institution that began in the era of radio, when it was deemed an existential threat to the newspaper industry. It evolved into the age of mass audiences, ushered in by the invention of television, and it navigated the complexities of reporting during the Second World War. We will imminently begin the Charter Review, which will set the terms of the BBC for the next decade, and through it we will collectively write the next chapter of the BBC's story. Together we will ensure the BBC is sustainably funded, commands the public's trust, and continues to drive growth, good jobs, skills and creativity across every region and nation of the UK. In an era in which trust is fraying and truth is contested across our nation, it will ensure the BBC remains fiercely independent and is genuinely accountable to the public it serves. We will publish a Green Paper and launch a public consultation shortly, and I will set out more detail to the House in the coming weeks. I would like to thank the outgoing Director General for his service and his commitment to public service broadcasting over many years. And I'd like to thank the CEO of News for leading the BBC's news operation through stormy times. I do not underestimate the challenge of taking on these roles and the personal toll that they can take on the individuals who hold them. As we write the next chapter of an institution that has stood at the centre of British public life for a century, our overarching goal is simple: to ensure the BBC can renew its mission for the modern age and continue to inform, educate and entertain, not just for the coming decade, but well into the next century. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Secretary of State.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Right Honourable Lady for advance notice of her statement. The BBC is in a sorry mess, and sadly, one of its own making, that has resulted in the resignations of the Director General and the CEO of News. These recent leadership changes are a response to the growing number of examples of bias in the BBC, one of which has resulted in a potential $1 billion lawsuit. This is why the Leader of the Opposition has said the BBC needs to change and needs saving from itself. Otherwise, we may all pay the price in reputational damage and in our pockets as licence fee payers. We all want the BBC to succeed, to be the best possible version of itself, but that requires institutional change and far more than a few moves at the top. But let me first acknowledge, Madam Deputy Speaker, some of the many good things that the BBC does well in delivering on its principles to inform, educate and entertain, from Strictly and Traitors to world-class natural history programming, sport and local radio, and coverage of major national events, including, of course, the recent remembrance services and events. These are things we can all be proud of, that contribute positively to the BBC's brand and reputation at home and abroad. But the BBC also has a charter obligation for impartiality, and too many examples have come to light exposing bias at the BBC, particularly as it relates to the news and current affairs output. Examples that have often strayed far away from the BBC's own editorial guidelines. The coverage of trans rights, selective push notifications of news, the Gaza documentary, the output of the Arabic news service, reliance on stats provided by Hamas, all speak to bias at the BBC. And at a time when anti-Semitism is rising around the world, the BBC should surely think twice about distributing questionable data from a terrorist organisation bent on the destruction of Israel. We expect better from our national broadcaster. And I'm glad that the BBC chair has admitted an error of judgment relating to the Panorama programme on Donald Trump, which involved editing of his speech to give the impression that he said something that he did not say. The BBC now faces a hefty lawsuit, and we do not want to see the taxpayer, the licence fee payer, or the rest of the BBC suffer because of the poor judgment of Panorama programme makers who seem unable to distinguish opinion from impartial journalism, who clearly all thought the same. And that's precisely the problem. It's remarkable that in every area of their operations, the BBC seeks inclusivity and diversity other than in thought, other than in political thinking. Does the Minister agree that that must change, that the BBC's culture needs to change? And does the Minister agree that the BBC must provide a fulsome apology to the US President and hopefully avoid legal action? And does she agree that the BBC would do well to apologise to the British public too? Does she also agree we need a root and branch review of the BBC's adherence to impartiality, particularly as it relates to news and current affairs, and that we need more than apologies and resignations at the top, but clear actions on complaints processing, on governance, on oversight and on compliance to ensure that the BBC sticks to its charter obligations on impartiality and that it rigidly and consistently abides by its own editorial guidelines. The Minister did mention the next steps in the BBC Charter review, but we would appreciate more details on timelines as soon as possible. And could she confirm, though, what discussions she's currently having with the BBC leadership about the search for the new Director General? And given that the BBC Arabic service is funded in part by the British taxpayer through FCDO grants, can she confirm what discussions she is having with her FCDO colleagues about its future funding and governance arrangements, and about the impact the BBC's editorial failings have had with Israel and our partners in the Middle East? Action must be taken, and the serious issues discussed today must be addressed, Madam Deputy Speaker, because the BBC must become, once again, an institution that all of us, not just some of us, can be proud of.
Secretary of State.
Well, can I thank the honourable gentleman? I know this has been an issue that has been of serious concern to him as it's unfolded over the past week. And can I say to him from the outset that I do strongly agree with him that 2 resignations are not the answer to the challenges that the BBC has faced, not just over the last week, but in recent months. I've come to this House too many times to share with the House progress updates on editorial failings. He mentioned some in relation to Gaza and to Glastonbury, but there have been others as well. I'm pleased that the chairman of the BBC, Dr. Samir Shah, has accepted where the institution has made mistakes. I'm pleased that he's been open with the chair of the Select Committee about that, and I'm pleased that he is setting out concrete actions that follow. I agree very much with the honourable gentleman that clear actions are important. They must be swift and they must be robust and they must be transparent. I also strongly agree with him that there is a problem of consistency in the way that those standards are consistently applied, which leaves individual journalists and individual presenters in a very difficult position. And that is a point that I've made to the Chairman and previously to the Director General. In terms of the search for the Director General, I have had discussions with the Chairman of the Board about that. The House should be aware that the Government does not appoint the Director General. As set out in the Charter, that is solely a matter for the Board, but we stand ready to provide support where it's requested and necessary in order to make sure that we get the highest calibre individual. I understand from the board that there is a desire to move quickly on that, but that the existing Director General will remain in place to ensure a smooth transition, and I will update the House as I receive further information. He also asked particularly about the BBC Arabic service and funding for the World Service. I think it's important to recognise that there have been serious concerns and failings on the part of the BBC Arabic service. In response to that, in his letter to the chair of the Select Committee, Dr. Shah set out a number of steps that are being taken. I understand these include structural changes as well as individual staff changes. But I would gently push back against the assertion that this should affect our support for the World Service. The World Service is a light on the hill for people in places of darkness, and there are many in the world at the moment, and this government strongly supports the World Service and will continue to do so.
Sarah Owen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Whatever the case with Donald Trump, who has actually said far worse than the wrongly edited clip showed, and it is a wrongly edited clip, the only ones rubbing their hands in glee right now during this whole debacle is those that do not want a free press. Those politicians who have deep pockets lined by goodness knows who. Those politicians that cosplay being journalists on RT and GB News, spreading division and hatred. I hope that all of us in this House would agree with the principle of keeping our public broadcaster free from political interference. So does the Secretary of State agree that it's time to review the influence of former Conservative spin doctor Robbie Gibb on the BBC's board?
Secretary of State.
Can I thank the Honourable Lady for her question? In relation to the board, she will be aware that the Charter sets a strict legal threshold that must be met before dismissal of a board member, and so I am unable to pursue the course of action that she suggests.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Anna Sabine.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Liberal Democrats have always pushed the BBC to be better, delivering genuinely balanced reporting, rigorous investigation and the best journalism in the world. We believe in a strong, independent, publicly funded BBC that values factuality, scrutiny and accountability in our democracy. The BBC clearly isn't perfect, and it's right that we hold it to the highest standards. The panorama editing error was a serious mistake, and we welcome the BBC's apology. The resignations of Tim Davie and Deborah Turness must be an opportunity for the BBC to turn a new leaf, to rebuild trust and return to its core mission to inform, educate and entertain. However, it is obvious to everyone that this issue is being weaponised by those who want to undermine the BBC and who would profit from its demise. Without the BBC, we are more vulnerable to the dangerous misinformation and conspiracy theories that populists like the member for Clacton and Donald Trump trade on, and we cannot let that happen. So as the government navigates Trump's latest tantrum, threatening to sue the BBC for $1 billion, can I ask the Secretary of State, what is she doing to stand up for the BBC, Britain's BBC, which is the most trusted source of information in the world? And speaking of interference by bad actors, serious concerns remain over the conduct of Sir Robbie Gibb during his tenure on the BBC board. We need to have absolute confidence that the BBC can operate free from political influence, factional interest or personal agendas. So if the Secretary of State truly believes in an independent BBC, will she now also sack Robbie Gibb, end the political grip on the BBC board and listen to Liberal Democrat calls to guarantee that the appointment of the next Director General is transparent, impartial and worthy of the trust that British public places in the BBC?
Thank the Honourable Lady. It's difficult to hear her over the noise, but she asked if we will stand up for the BBC. I think she's heard my words to the House today. The BBC is one of the most important institutions in the country. It stood at the centre of our democratic and cultural life for over a century. And how will we stand up for the BBC? By putting it on a firm footing through the charter process that we're about to start. She will have heard, in relation to her concerns about board members, she will have heard that the answer that I gave to my honourable friend.
Rupert Hook. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for her leadership on this and wholeheartedly welcome her words that political figures shouldn't be presenters of the news. Surely this should also apply to arbiters of news standards. I wonder if in the reforms we could look at the 4-person Editorial Standards Committee, now that 2 of them have gone in the resignations, leaving the most senior one, someone who's owned a newspaper in this time, breaching the IPC guidelines, the ex-Conservative Director of Communications, Robbie Gibb.
She mentions the Editorial Standards Committee, the ESGC, which has been the source of much debate and scrutiny over recent days. I have discussed this directly with the chair of the BBC. I understand that changes are planned to that committee and I very much welcome that decision.
Chair of the Select Committee, Dame Caroline Dining.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Chair. Thank you to the Secretary of State for her statement, and I'd like to echo her words about the Director General and the Head of News. She'll know that the airwaves over the last couple of days have been dominated by a number of debates around the BBC, the concern about bias, particularly in some of the most contentious issues, the ability of the board to effectively govern, but most of all around editorial standards and accuracy. And it's this last point which has led the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee, which I chair, to issue invitations today for non-executive members of BBC Editorial Guidance and Standards Committee, Dr Samir Shah, Caroline Thompson and Robbie Gibb, and the former external independent advisors, Michael Prescott and Caroline Daniels, to appear before us in the weeks ahead. In the meantime, can I ask the Secretary of State, what support is her department giving the BBC at every level to steady this ship? And in terms of charter review, I heard her use the words imminently and shortly, but I have heard similar words since the beginning of the year, so I wonder if she can be more specific on the timelines.
Secretary of State. Thank you. Can I first of all welcome the action that her Select Committee is taking, that she's announced to the House today. I think in order to maintain confidence in the BBC, it's absolutely essential that the BBC is transparent about the actions that they've taken and the actions they intend to take. And it is very welcome that she is ensuring that the fullest explanation is given, not just to this House, but to the public as well. In terms of the timing of the Charter review, she will have heard what I said to her committee when I appeared before them recently, that we will start that Charter review process before the end of the year. And I will, of course, return to this House as soon as those timings are finalised in order to put that before the House and give members the chance to debate that. She also asked what action we as a government are taking to support the board through what is clearly a tumultuous time. I've been working very closely with the chairman of the BBC in recent days. I've spoken to him daily and the Director General as well. And we have been clear as a government that we stand ready to provide all of the support that the board needs in order to appoint the highest calibre person to that post of Director General and to consider what changes they might want to make to senior leadership structures and roles as a result of the deliberations that they've had. Of course, the BBC is independent of government. It's essential that they're given the space to be able to get on with this process. But we have been working very closely with the BBC chairman at his request in order to make sure that the BBC can continue to thrive.
Natasha Irons.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think now more than ever, the role of the BBC in our national story, in our democracy and in the trust that we put in it is vitally important. But trust isn't given, it is earned, and we can't shy away from when things go wrong. So does she agree with me that the Charter should focus on transparency, accountability and measurable commitments to impartiality as the surest way to ensure that the BBC's trust is retained?
Secretary
I do agree with the honourable member. I would just add to that as well as the very important issues around standards, trust, accountability and independence from government, any government, including ours, because the BBC plays a critical role in holding a mirror up not just to society but to governments of all political persuasions. I would just add as well that the BBC has always been one of the strongest drivers of the creative industries across every nation and region, and as part of the Charter review process we will be working to strengthen that to make sure that the BBC is able to tell the story of our whole nation and not just some.
Sir Oliver Dowden.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I actually joined the Culture Secretary in paying tribute to the Director General of the BBC. I actually found him rather helpful on issues such as anti-Semitism, but the problem with the BBC goes much deeper than the current leadership. Does she agree with me? First of all, it goes to the cultural disposition of the BBC, whereby people that work for it have an overwhelming metropolitan outlook and obsess about issues such as BLM and Palestine in a way that suburban and provincial England does not. Moreover, when one looks at the output of the BBC, including areas such as drama, my constituents are sick of waiting for the lecture from the BBC in that kind of output. Now, that is the case from other broadcasters, but the difference with the BBC is that my constituents pay for it. And there is a real problem with the BBC now, whereby many people feel that it represents half of the United Kingdom, not the other half. And for those of us who want the BBC to succeed, does she agree with me this must be addressed as a matter of urgency?
Well, the challenges that he describes don't specifically relate just to the BBC. I have voiced concerns, as many culture secretaries on the other side of this House have done previously, about the overwhelming concentration of the media industry from one background and in one region. And I believe, as many of my predecessors on the other side of this House believe, that that does need to change. But I would just caution the focus particularly on the BBC here, because that is a problem for the media industry as a whole and therefore for the public debate that we're able to have. And actually the BBC over the years, through the work that they've done at Media City in Salford, through the work that they're doing at Digbeth Lock in Birmingham, is one of the organisations that is at the forefront of changing that. I agree with him, though, that there has to be a level of challenge, internal challenge, within any successful organisation. And in the discussions that I've been having with the chairman of the BBC and the Director General in recent days, that has been the subject of a lot of the concerns that I have raised.
Paul Law.
Deputy Speaker, as a former journalist and as a former member of the Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee, I know more than most some of the failings of the BBC, but also some of its great strengths, not least in combating misinformation online. I know many of its journalists personally, and have to say many of them take ultra seriously their duties to provide fair, impartial and, yes, fearless news coverage. And it's the fearlessness that often upsets this place on either side. And I have to say, yes, this was a serious error by the Panorama team, and a correction should have been swiftly issued. But that doesn't mean that the BBC as an institution should be undermined. And there are enemies on left and right who want to see the demise of the BBC, who should rue that day if it ever happens.
Secretary of State.
Well, I agree with him. I agree with him, first of all, on the point that he makes about the seriousness of some of the failings and the need to uphold the higher standards. I also agree with him about the challenges and attacks that the BBC faces from both left and right. I think the real division when it comes to the debate about the BBC is not between left and right, it's between those of us who think that the national broadcaster is there to represent their worldview and those of us who believe that our national broadcaster is here to challenge all of us.
Damian Hines.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The internet is full of people who think they are in touch with a bigger truth, and in getting that across, it doesn't matter what happens to all sorts of littler truths along the way. Samir Shah, in his letter to the chair of the committee, spoke of the sacred job of the BBC to use evidence that can be trusted, and that is more important than ever. And does she agree that actually it's things like this that give ammunition to people who say disregard the BBC, don't look at the MSM, consider all sources to be the same? And isn't the most worrying thing, not that a mistake happened, because mistakes happen in big organisations, but that it took this long for it to be corrected? And does she agree that in future corrections must always be made very swiftly and proactively?
Secretary of State.
Thank you. Yeah, and this concern about the length of time that it takes to respond is something that I've reflected to the BBC leadership, not just in relation to this episode, but previously as well. I think it really does undermine trust and confidence in the BBC, because when it takes some time, if there's not a proper explanation as to why it has taken some time, it leads people to believe that there is a complacency at the top of the organisation. I think that's something that the chairman has heard loud and clear and has taken on board as part of the learning from this episode. And I also agree with him that, you know, as somebody who has shared some of my frustrations with the BBC leadership and some of the failings that have happened over the last 16 months with this House, that the reason that I and others have been frustrated is because the BBC holds such an important place in our national life and has to command the trust of the whole public.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think we can all hear the frustration of the Secretary of State that we're in this position. She's absolutely right. There must be a period of introspection at the BBC as to how this has come to pass, because it is true that trust in our national institutions is declining. I must take issue, though, with something that she said, because she said this is a national institution that belongs to us all. My constituents, and I wager people's constituents across this House, are deeply concerned by the political attacks on the BBC, whether they come from at home or abroad, and they want to see it protected because they think they own it, but the honest truth is at the moment they don't. Now, I know in the past my honourable friend has been interested in these ideas, but with charter renewal coming, might she meet with a group of us to look at how issues like mutualisation might be the future to giving back trust and confidence in the BBC and genuinely protecting it from forms of political institution by giving it to the public to be part of running it?
Secretary of State.
Thank you. I mean, I stand absolutely by the assertion that the BBC belongs to us all. It's funded by the licence fee payer, but more than that, it is one of the few shared spaces and places that we have in this country. I was reflecting on this on Remembrance Sunday as I stood at the cenotaph, and before that, when we did the VE commemorations earlier this year, that there are very few broadcasters in this country who could provide those moments when the entire country stops and comes together through a shared experience. And I would, of course, be delighted to meet with my honourable friend to discuss some of the suggestions that she makes.
Sir John Whittingdale.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The BBC has said that the editing of the Panorama programme gave the impression of a direct call for violent action, something that they then described as an error of judgment, which seems an extraordinary understatement. Does the Secretary of State share my concern that this was considered by the Editorial Guidelines and Standards Committee in May, but nothing was done. And should not, as a first step, the Editorial Guidelines and Standards Committee be made far tougher and fully independent? And will she consider this and other measures as part of the Charter review that she is undertaking as a way of strengthening the impartiality requirement that was inserted in the last Charter review?
Can I thank him for that suggestion, and I look forward to having more detailed conversations with him as we start the Charter review process. As a former Culture Secretary himself, I would welcome the opportunity to do so. He raises the specific issue of the committee meeting that took place in May. My understanding is that there was a meeting in January and then a further meeting in May, and that that was done at the BBC's own request, but that there was then a failure to follow through. I don't want to speak for the BBC. It's not the role of me to answer questions on behalf of the BBC about how they took those decisions, but I note with interest that the Select Committee will be calling members of that committee to appear before them, and I'm sure that will be one of the things that they will be seeking to probe.
Graham Stringer.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't think any reasonable person can think that the programme put out by Panorama was a mistake. It was clearly manipulation with a purpose. And unfortunately, it follows a long line. I'm not going to list them all, other honourable members have done that, but it includes Gaza, anti-women trans issues, Europe, and in my own constituency, a programme was put out a few years ago called People Like Us, where contributors had been paid to fight young women. Other contributors had been sent on holiday in order to say particular things. So I don't think that the biggest threat to the BBC is some conspiracy. I hope my right honourable friend agrees with me. The biggest threat to the BBC is a failure to uphold objectivity and the standards we expect from the BBC.
Secretary of State.
I mean, I absolutely share his view about the seriousness of the failings that the BBC has accepted this week and the need for clear, robust, firm and swift action in response to that. I would, though, like to just remind the House that the BBC is responsible for thousands of hours of output across multiple channels, including some of the most popular and entertaining programmes in this country, including some of the highest quality children's television output that the world has. They're responsible for the BBC World Service, which is renowned and revered the world over and plays an essential role in our global democracy, and it's responsible for regional news that is highly trusted and reaches stories and people and communities that others can't reach. I say that not to downplay in any sense the seriousness of the concerns that have been raised this week, but just to make clear that the BBC as an institution is absolutely essential to this country, and when we hold it to the highest standards, it's because we need it to thrive.
Gavin Robinson.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. To interrogate honourably, the BBC needs to have a level of integrity. Yet they have diminished themselves in ignoring a report for 6 months that didn't just look at one Panorama programme, but looked at a litany of failures. They piously show religious observance to the principles of integrity and impartiality, but when challenged and when criticised, they sacrifice all of that on the altar of supreme arrogance. And today, hearing that the high priest of partiality, Jonathan Munro, continues to defend the editorial decisions of the Panorama programme, does the Secretary of State believes that he too must go?
Well, he'll have heard the answer that I gave to my honourable friend. It's not for me to decide, or for any government to decide who is employed by the BBC and who isn't, but of course I agree with him that integrity and impartiality are vital.
Andrew Pakes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Like some of the colleagues in the House, I often start my morning with Dottie on BBC Cambridgeshire and end my days with Amelia on BBC Look East. I say this because it demonstrates that the BBC is much more than an editorial decision-making at its national level. Every day, thousands of BBC staff are telling our stories, representing our communities and being part of the fabric of this country. As a former BEC2 official, I've spoken with many BBC staff and NUJ and BEC2 members over recent days who are horrified by some of the coverage that's happening around this. They want accountability and they want the BBC to restore its trust, but they also want a message that their work is valued and that they are part of the future of a BBC and the future of public service broadcasting. Would my right honourable member agree with me? It's the talent that makes the BBC an institution, and that talent needs to be nurtured as well as dealing with its leadership.
Can I thank him, not just for the point that he makes, but the really compelling way in which he makes it. Like him, I have been astonished by the calibre of BBC staff, whether it's the back office staff that so often don't get the credit, the journalists who work tirelessly in communities up and down the country to tell stories that would otherwise not be heard, or whether it's the young apprentices who start out with the most incredible opportunities and go on to have amazing careers because of the institution that is the BBC and the work that is done to support them. I know this has had an impact on many BBC journalists. I do want them to hear directly from this government how much we value, treasure and support them. I do also want to say to the House that in all of the conversations I've had with major investors who come to this country to invest in film and TV production here, the BBC is for all of them, without exception, a major draw because of the work that it does in skilling up a generation of talent and providing the institutions and facilities that they need in order to come here.
Sir Julian Smith.
I welcome the tone of her statement, but it's not just editorial challenges for the BBC. There's been a total lack of deftness on dealing with talent-related issues and other scandals over the past few years. Also governance. We've got BBC Studios, a commercial organisation with separate whistleblowing schemes whilst hiding behind the BBC brand. Would she reflect on the broader skills needed to make the changes necessary so the BBC can maximise the huge global opportunities, both in news and in productions?
He's absolutely right to raise the issue of the handling, lack of deftness, and also I would add lack of urgency in relation to some of these issues that have arisen over the past couple of years. I would say to him, let this be the moment that this changes. That is the tone and nature of the conversations that I've been having with the senior leadership of the BBC, and I would also echo the points that he makes about the skill sets that are required in order to make sure that the BBC can get onto a firm footing as we begin this next chapter.
Sonia Antoniazzi.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm no BBC basher. I want to protect it. I've written to the Secretary of State this morning, along with a number of cross-party MPs, asking if she will ask the BBC board exactly why it delayed issuing an appropriate apology over the Panorama Trump edit, because this delay, as we know, inflicted further damage on the BBC, our country's most trusted news source. And I agree with Hannah Barnes that she said in an article yesterday in the New Statesman that the corporation must turn this crisis into an opportunity. So will she also seek clarity from the former Director General Tim Davie about the worrying words in his resignation letter that the BBC needs to be championed and not weaponised?
Can I thank the Honourable Lady for the letter that I received earlier today? I have discussed this particular issue with the BBC about the delay in issuing an apology. I've been given a full account by the chairman of the board. It's not for me to answer on behalf of the BBC, but she will have heard that the Select Committee intends to call members of that committee, and I'm sure this will be a question that they'll raise with them.
Pete Wishart.
Madam Deputy Speaker. Debates about partiality, of course, is something that we in Scotland are more than familiar with, particularly if you're on the 50% side of Scottish independence. But these sustained attacks on the BBC by forces that seek to undermine and mould it into their instrument must be resisted. And surely this could be assisted by the sacking of Robbie Gibb. But will she assure me that any changes in leadership, BBC Scotland's editorial independence will be maintained and it will continue to serve us according to our national debate and our political culture.
Well, he'll have heard the comments that I made about the legal threshold that must be met for any changes in leadership. The government appoints the chair of the BBC. We don't appoint individual staff members, and the board member that he mentioned was appointed by the last Conservative government, and his term was renewed just weeks before the general election. So I'm unable to take the action that he requests. But in terms of, he mentions nations and regions, which are very close to my heart as well. Through the Charter review process, we will be seeking to ensure that the nations and regions of the BBC are able to drive the direction of the organisation, and that people in every part of the UK will be able to see a fair share of content that reflects their lives, their communities and their contribution.
Daniel Zeitler.
I spent time yesterday with journalists at BBC Radio Cambridgeshire admiring their dedication and professionalism, which stands in marked contrast to this shabby debacle that sullies a great institution's reputation. But isn't part of the problem the fragmentation of what should be a public service? And frankly, this failure is symptomatic of the long-term fragmentation of so many of our public services, which have been a consequence of the party opposite.
Well, as I said to the House just a moment ago, the Charter review marks the start of the next chapter of the BBC and its long and proud history, and that will be the moment when we will be able to come together as a whole House and as a whole country to agree the future of the BBC.
Spirit House.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There are certainly many questions, particularly to those who deliberately set out to destroy the BBC. But I want to ask her this particular question in the absence of not being able to remove certain members from the board. Can she not make a commitment that all future appointments should be conducted through a transparent process rather than being political appointments?
Well, the House was asked to approve the terms of the last Charter, and similarly the House will be asked to approve the terms of the next Charter, which will set out how the BBC will operate for the next decade. It will certainly look at issues around appointments and transparency and structures as well. That will be her opportunity to get involved.
Pamela Nash.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Many have expressed their annoyance at the BBC in recent days for being too woke or too Tory or too liberal, or in my case, for allowing the Honourable Member for Clacton to appear on the Question Time panel more often than he's appeared in his own constituency. But isn't the fact, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the BBC has been attacked by every side evidence that the BBC continues to make every effort to maintain balance in a world of increasingly polarised and divisive media?
She makes the important point that although none of us should seek to downplay the seriousness of the failings which the BBC has admitted, accepted, apologised for and now must show tangible action in order to address, the BBC is and remains the most trusted source of news in this country and one of the most trusted sources of news all over the world, and we lose it at its peril, at our peril.
Rebecca Paul.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Like many here, I want to see the BBC rebuild public trust and return to its core mission. But it must be recognised that as a result of its pro-gender ideology bias, they failed to adequately report on issues such as the use of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones in children, the placing of violent men in women's prisons, and the loss of women's medals in sport to biological males. And on top of all that, they've attributed the crimes of violent men to women. Calling a male sex offender she can never be responsible, impartial journalism. How does the Secretary of State intend to ensure that the BBC moves away from its current ideological approach on gender to one that is based on facts and evidence?
Secretary of State.
Well, I'll just gently say to the Honourable Lady that she wants the BBC to return to its core mission, but that is deeply contested, as you could just hear in this House. I don't believe that it is the role of elected politicians to tell any broadcaster what they can and can't produce, what they can and can't say, or to get involved in the minutiae of editorial decisions. I do think it is the right and proper role of this House to make sure that editorial standards are robust, they are thorough, they are well thought through, and they're applied consistently. That's what this government has been seeking to uphold in the conversations that we've had with the BBC in recent weeks, and will continue to do so.
Graham Morris.
Thank you. These are indeed uncertain times for the BBC and for the people who work in it. Would the Secretary of State agree with me that it's important that we remember that the 2025 Reuters Institute Digital News Report found that the BBC remains the most trustworthy news brand in the UK, with 60% of respondents rating it highly for trust? And would the Secretary of State also agree that the BBC must respond to criticism in a considered and proportionate manner, carrying out investigations with regard to due process, and should not be subject to political interference, nor for that matter interference from commercial competitors?
He's absolutely right to raise the point about trust. The BBC is one of the most trusted institutions, not just in our country, but in the world. We seek to ensure that they uphold the highest standards, because that is of such value and importance to all of us in the United Kingdom. And can I thank him for his words?
Ben Lake.
I was very pleased to hear the Secretary of State confirm that the nations and regions will form a very important part of the BBC Charter Review. And to that end, she will know, of course, that over 90% of S4C's funding is derived from the BBC licence fee. So can I ask her that in the process of the BBC Charter Review, the financial stability of S4C will be a key consideration for the government?
I've been very pleased to meet with the leadership at S4C after what's been a difficult time. This government reaffirms the importance of S4C to our national life, and I look forward to working with him as we start the Charter Review process to make sure that that continues.
Matt Rodder.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, staff at the former BBC monitoring station in Caversham in my constituency played a vital role over many years monitoring broadcasts from around the world, and indeed they broke a number of important news stories over the years, including the Iranian Revolution, only possible because of the public service model and the dedication of the staff and their skills. Could I, also, I welcome the Secretary of State's statement today. Could I ask her to say a few words of thanks to the staff of the BBC for their continued work and its vital role as a public institution?
Yes, you'll have heard the comments that I made earlier in response to my honourable friend. I want to commend those many BBC staff, particularly those who put themselves in danger in order to report fearlessly from parts of the world where that is not possible. Recently, I came to this dispatch box to pay tribute to all of those journalists operating in Gaza in particular, where the loss of life has been without precedent. We owe them a great debt of thanks, and I'd like to place that on record today.
Sir Roger Gale.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a very long time since I was taught to edit tape with a China graph pencil and a razor blade. But the fundamental principle remains the same. You don't change the sense of what somebody has said, ever. Those who have read the transcript of Trump's speech and then compared it with the Panorama edit know full well that that programme was a travesty of journalism and deeply dishonest. And it also represented a desperate lack of editorial control. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, I part company now with some of my colleagues. I believe, and I still believe, that the overwhelming majority of the journalists employed by the BBC, and for the record, those employed by independent television and Sky News, work fearlessly, faithfully, and honestly to deliver the truth. And where those are working overseas, as has been said, with great courage also. And I hope the Secretary of State, therefore, will resist, with all her power, the calls of those on both sides of this House and outside it, who would seek to destroy what is one of the jewels in our national crown.
Secretary of State.
I'm happy to give him that assurance.
Joe Morris.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I echo solidarity with BBC journalists that's been expressed across the House. Can the Secretary of State assure myself and other members that measures will be taken in the forthcoming Charter Review to ensure that all political appointments to the BBC Board are made with full public scrutiny and that such appointees will not be involved in any editorial capacity in the future in order to protect the integrity, credibility and independence of the most important bastion of public service broadcasting in Britain and beyond?
Can I thank the Honourable Member for his words, and can I also thank members across this House for the tone of this debate. I know that the failings of the BBC editorial process in recent days are something that all members feel very strongly about, but it is a credit to this House that we can have a sensible and measured debate about the actions that are needed to address it.
Sian Berry. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The BBC employs thousands of tremendous journalists working with diligent truth-seeking and impartiality. It's not perfect, but we must defend this national asset, and we cannot be left to the wolves of the kind of channels Trump prefers, which have propaganda values, not ethics and integrity. So will the Secretary of State protect our BBC from all further political interference, listen to the cross-party voices here and put an end to all political appointments and remove those already in place, like Robbie Gibb, if not immediately, then in that process?
She'll have heard my comments to other honourable members about the appointments process, and the Charter Review offers this whole House the opportunity to look again at how those appointments are made and which roles exist. In relation to the points that she makes about the BBC and the environment in which it's operating, this is something that we as a government are particularly concerned about. The blurring of news and fact with opinion and polemic, and therefore the inability of viewers to turn on their TV screens and understand what it is that they're watching. I've raised with the Select Committee previously my concerns about politicians presenting news on programmes that are not necessarily deemed news programmes. As politicians, we are required to have an opinion and a point of view. That is very different from presenting impartial facts, and it's something that this government is looking to address.
Alex Mayer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The BBC is unique and special and ours. And yes, it's absolutely a part of the national conversation. But importantly, it's also a part of the regional and local conversation. I have fantastic local journalists in my patch on 3 Counties Radio and on Look East. And what's special is that if you have a local story that a local journalist has gone out to find, it can so quickly get onto the national stage because of our BBC. Would the Secretary of State assure me that in the forthcoming Charter Review, she will take very seriously the issue of local news coverage to make sure that that is protected and enhanced?
Secretary of State.
I'm happy to give that assurance. We're looking both at the charter process and how we can help to support and defend local news through the work that the BBC does, but also she will know that this government is developing a local news strategy to help our local newspapers to be able to survive and thrive in an era in which they face significant pressure. And she's absolutely right to say that this is not just about reflecting the whole nation, although that is an essential role that local news plays. It's also often the training ground for some of our most talented journalists who would otherwise not get those opportunities, and so we're determined to strengthen and protect it.
Sir Julian Lewis.
I would fight in the last ditch to prevent the BBC ceasing to be a public service broadcaster and to prevent it being broken up. Any large organisation can have bad actors who behave unethically, and that has happened on this occasion. But it does the BBC no service when people parrot the line that the person responsible for this crisis is not the idiot who tampered with Donald Trump's quote, but a former Tory spin doctor, one of 13 members of the board who allegedly influenced other members of the board to somehow provoke this present crisis. The crisis has nothing to do with Robbie Gibb. It has something to do with a mindset that on the front page of today's Guardian has the whole thing about Robbie Gibb and relegates the fact that $1 billion lawsuit may be taken out by Donald Trump against the BBC to a tiny paragraph at the end of the article on page 2. If you want to know what's wrong with some bits of the BBC, read The Guardian today.
Secretary of State.
I'm not, Madam Deputy, I'm not entirely sure how to respond to that, but I think the honourable member's views are now on the record.
Chris Kane.
Madam Deputy Speaker, we've heard an awful lot today about the professionalism of the journalists at the BBC, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. But there's less of them now than there was last year, and we hear that the BBC is in the fight of its life across a whole number of fronts. Well, when you're in a fight across multiple fronts, it seems odd to send some of your best fighters home, but that's what's happening to our journalists, where there are less of them in our newsrooms. Does she agree with me that journalism delivered free from fear or favour costs money, and it costs a lot of money to do it really, really well? So delivering that has to be at the centre of gravity for the BBC now and in the future, and how we protect journalism and resource it properly has to be at the heart of the Charter Review.
Secretary of State.
Yes, I agree with him, and can I assure him that that is very much central to the Charter Review process that we are about to begin. He's right to say that fearless and robust journalism costs money. It's essential that the BBC is fairly and sustainably resourced for years to come. As a government, we are keeping an open mind about how that may unfold. But what I have said, and I'm happy to repeat to this House today, is that we have ruled out funding the BBC through general taxation, because whilst it's absolutely essential that good journalism is well resourced, it is also absolutely essential that the BBC remains independent from government and is able to hold us to account without fear or favour.
Manuela Pertegala.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's essential that the BBC's independence and impartiality are upheld at all times. And I'm afraid there have been serious concerns raised about Sir Robbie Gibb's conduct on the BBC board, including alleged attempts to influence recruitment and editorial decisions. So if the Secretary of State cannot remove Gibb from the board and cannot end political appointments now, what actions can she take to restore public confidence in the BBC governance?
I would just start by saying that although everyone in this House is right to take with the utmost seriousness the failings that the BBC has accepted have happened over the course of this year, I would also just gently push back against the idea that the public has lost confidence in the BBC. It does remain the most trusted source of news in this country, and as I said earlier, in many parts of the world as well. In terms of the actions that I can take as the Secretary of State, I'm working very closely to support the Chairman of the Board through what are obviously tumultuous times. The Director General has agreed to stay on in order to see the organisation through that transition. We've already had discussions about the process for recruiting for a new Director General and the need to strengthen the work of the board and senior leadership when it comes to editorial oversight. That includes, as I said in answer to the Honourable Gentleman a moment ago, a discussion about the mix of skills and experience that is needed at the highest levels of the organisation.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Secretary of State's statement today because, of course, it's absolutely right to hold the BBC to the highest standard, because that's actually the best way to defend our national broadcaster. But does she agree with me that it's not acceptable for members of this House who are paid by the BBC's commercial rivals, in fact, looking at the time, one of them's probably in makeup as we speak, to use their status as an MP to mount sustained and frenzied attacks that have only one aim: to destroy this British national institution?
Secretary of State.
Well, as I said to the House earlier, there is a difference between the absolutely legitimate and right and proper role of members of this House to to raise serious concerns about the decisions that have been made at the BBC over recent months and the response to them. There is a difference between that and a sustained attack on an institution that has stood at the centre of public life for over a century and belongs to us all.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State very much for her answers in the statement. It has been clear over years that there's been a bias in the BBC. I have concerns over the last 12 months on at least 4 topics. BBC bias against Brexit, BBC bias against my party, the DUP, elected representatives back home in Northern Ireland who refused to engage with the BBC, BBC bias for Gaza against Israel, BBC bias against Free Iran government in exile, with the BBC promoting the son of a former dictator. My goodness me, it's quite unbelievable. 2 people have resigned, but the canker of editorial control is still there. So, Secretary of State, the question I have today is just when will it end? Is this just a pause, or is this the end? Thank you.
Secretary of State.
Well, can I reassure him that, as somebody who has shared my frustrations with some of the failures at the BBC over the last 16 months and my frustrations about the response at times, that I have felt very much throughout this process that there is a recognition of the seriousness of this at the highest levels of the BBC. And in the conversations that I've had with senior leadership in the institution, there is also a discussion and a consideration of what wider changes need to be made in order to maintain and uphold the highest standards going forwards. He asked when will it end. I think the answer to that has to be now.
Jim Dixon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I welcome the statement from the Secretary of State, particularly her strong support for the BBC as an institution that belongs to us all. Does she agree with me that, as she noted, with the BBC regularly rated worldwide as one of the most trusted news sources globally, that a strong BBC not only acts as a bulwark locally and in this country against misinformation, but also across other parts of the world, critical parts of the world, where there are very few other trusted news sources, and that in delivering services to those parts of the world, those services must be properly funded as well.
Secretary of State.
I do agree with him, and it's not lost on anyone in this House that at a time when other countries who don't necessarily have the UK's best interests at heart are investing heavily in state-funded propaganda, it's essential that the BBC continues to be a light on the hill for people in times of darkness.
David Mundell.
I've long been a champion of the BBC as a UK national institution, but at the last Charter review I did raise my concerns about the prevalence of a metropolitan elite at the heart of the BBC, not just at UK level but in Scotland, who don't always convey that they understand or indeed respect rural or older constituents like my own. So will the Secretary of State confirm that an outcome of this Charter review will be that in order to preserve the BBC as a national institution, it will convey that understanding of people right across the UK, wherever they live?
I can and I will, and I do share his view that the story of the whole nation has to be told, and the best way to ensure that it is told is to ensure that all of us are involved in telling it, not just some. So when we look at the Charter review, there will be a particular focus on our nations and regions. I've said previously that although I absolutely commend the work that the BBC has done, they've been leaders in this field at moving jobs, programming and skills out of London. What I want to see is a shift in commissioning power so that in every nation and region, we decide the story that we tell about ourselves to ourselves as a nation.
John Slinger.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We should be rigorous in holding the BBC to account, especially when it makes mistakes. But does my right honourable friend agree that some of those who jump on any infraction with glee may have ulterior motives? And does she further agree that the BBC is a beacon of fearless, impartial journalism here and abroad? and that as misinformation and disinformation grow, as attempts to attack media outlets by those suspicious of its values are on the rise, the BBC is needed more than ever.
I agree with him about the centrality of the BBC to our public life, and all of us in this House, I think, should be rightly seeking to ensure that the BBC upholds the highest standards whilst defending, protecting it as an institution and considering together how we can ensure that it stands at the centre of our public life for many more decades to come.
Sir Alex Shelbrooke.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I was pleased to hear the government last week announce that in the education curriculum they're going to be tackling fake news and what that's about. And I always say to children when I go to the schools about how you can trust journalism is, can you sue the person who wrote it? So I actually welcome the writ that's coming from America. I hope it can be sorted out, but I welcome that writ purely to say that if something's wrong, you can do it. But the basis of why we're here today, and forget all of the politicking about who's on the board and what is it about Trump or anything else, is that the BBC faked a piece of news. And how that happened, we've really got to get to the heart of. So may I ask the Secretary of State that she uses her office to work with the current Director General to get right to the heart of how this was ever allowed to happen, because that fundamentally is, we've heard and we all believe that the BBC is a respected journalistic organisation, but this is probably the biggest crisis it currently faces, because right now you can honestly say they faked the news.
Secretary of State.
Well, he asks if I'll use the office that I hold to ensure that we get to the bottom of this and that there's full transparency. I will, of course, do that, and I think the whole House will also be grateful to the Honourable Member, the Chair of the Select Committee, for taking action quickly to make sure that account is open to the public and transparent as well.
Gregory Campbell.
Deputy Speaker, sometimes there is a case of the Westminster bubble when assessing things like the BBC and then the real world outside. Some of us in Northern Ireland have been pressing the BBC for many, many years to be more transparent, to be more independent, to be more impartial. So this latest debacle is but one in a long line. And we're not talking about light entertainment or drama. No one questions that, and that by and large gets a green light from most people. It is news and current affairs. And there's no point in people distracting by introducing a conspiracy within the BBC board. Is now not the time for an opportunity to start afresh with a transformed BBC service to give us an impartial news service that many of us have demanded for years?
Secretary of State.
Well, the Charter Review will provide us with an opportunity to do just that.
Dr Andrew Murrison.
Speaker, why does the Minister think that the national leadership of the BBC has spent hundreds of thousands of pounds of licence fee payers' money resisting attempts to get the publication of the Biden report in 2004? And does she suspect, like I do, that it might be because the conclusions drawn 20 years ago very similar to the conclusions that have been made apparent in the now leaked Michael Prescott report, particularly around a culture that makes it possible for it to be okay to doctor and distort the facts in order to suit a pre-formed agenda.
Well, I think that's a question for the BBC, but when the editorial members of the editorial committee appear before the Select Committee, I'm sure that is something that the committee will rightly challenge them on.
Al Pinkerton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Earlier this year, as part of the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme, I had the great privilege of visiting the 77th Brigade, the Russian anti-disinformation brigade of the British Army, down in Newbury. And what they told us there, from the experts who are on the front line of the information wars, is that the British population, every single day, are being subjected to thousands and tens of thousands of messages designed to seed distrust between government and citizen, to break our belief in our institutions. The United Kingdom is in an incredibly privileged position in that we have a state broadcaster that provides us with something that might resemble a national culture. If we were to lose that, we would be feeding the forces that stand against us. Does the Secretary of State agree with me, or does the Minister agree with me, that The BBC provides a vital connection to our past. It unifies us together. And as well as being a source of education, information and entertainment, it's also a great source of national resilience.
Secretary of State.
I agree with him, and I think if the BBC didn't exist in the times that we live in, we'd be seeking to invent it.
Peter Fortune.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Just to touch on something that the Secretary of State alluded to earlier, one of the vital services that the BBC provides is supporting local media, an industry that I worked in for 10 years. And they do this through their local democracy reporting scheme, and it helps to bring forward the next generation of journalists and reporters. So would she agree with me that it is imperative, therefore, that the BBC win back the trust and the discipline and the culture of impartiality so that this can be inculcated into the next generation of journalists so that they can report without fear or favour?
Secretary of State.
I do agree with him, and that's why this government will also resist attacks on the institution itself from members across this whole House who voiced those in recent days. The local democracy reporting service that he talks about is a vital part of our local democracy. It also helps to create the next generation of journalists who might not otherwise have opportunities to work in journalism and have the opportunity to tell the stories that matter so much to all of us across this House.
Annalise Midgley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Robbie Gibb, faithful or traitor?
Secretary of State.
Perhaps the honourable lady and I can hear her views about that over a few drinks later on.
Sammy Wilson.
Madam Deputy Speaker. The fact of the matter is, this is not just about manipulating the speech of a president who the BBC clearly detest. There were other allegations made about promoting Hamas propaganda, about producing fake stories about race bias, about censoring people who were gender critical, and promoting stories, one-sided view of climate change and a whole range of other issues. And what has been the response of the BBC? To roll out the lefty lovies to try and justify their position and then indicate that they were victims of some right-wing coup. Does a response not show that this body, which has fabricated the news, misused its monopoly and hidden behind the protection of politicians in this House, far too cowardly to take them on over the years, does this not show that this body is not capable of change? And like many millions across the United Kingdom, I object to paying for this, and I hope that in the review the Minister will decide that there should be no more enforced taxation.
Order. Secretary of State.
Well, it won't surprise him to learn that I don't agree with that, and I don't share his characterisation of an institution that plays a vital role in this country. I just gently say to him, I don't think most people do either, and whilst I'm sure the public have been extremely concerned about the very serious failings that have been accepted this week by the BBC, it still remains the most trusted source of news in this country. I would also just say to all members of this House that there's been a lot of discussion today about individuals and individuals who are held to be responsible for all of the problems at the BBC, whether they're individuals who serve on the board or individuals who serve as senior executives. My assessment of the failures that have been admitted over recent years is that they stem from not an institutional bias, but a need to have sufficient rigour and oversight at the top of the organisation that is applied consistently across the board. That is something that I know the chairman of the BBC is seeking to achieve, and as a government we stand ready to support them in that.
Pam Cox.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In the early 2000s, I lived in Hanoi alongside my husband, who was reporting on Vietnam for the BBC, and I saw for myself how he and the BBC worked very hard for truth. He then spent a year in Myanmar working alongside extraordinarily brave local journalists under a military dictatorship who were seeking to expand public broadcasting. So does the Secretary of State agree with me that the BBC's trusted journalism is one of our strongest defences against disinformation, both at home and abroad?
Secretary of State.
I do agree with her, and I'd also like to pay tribute to the work that BBC Verify does in helping to empower our citizens to be able to navigate a very difficult news environment.
Rupert Lowe.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Auntie is definitively a monopoly. When Mr Reith, for good reason, wrote into the Charter that she should inform, educate and entertain with complete impartiality, he did it for good reason. This recent disgusting episode with this Panorama programme, where we've undermined our relationship probably with our greatest ally, is just the tip of the iceberg. So would the Minister agree with me that now is the time to responsibly defund this monopoly? And if she doesn't agree with that, would she agree it's time for root and branch reform, with a view to ensuring that, in the same way that she's done with football club boards, we see people who are actually forced to pay for this service represented across the country on the board of the BBC?
Secretary of State.
Well, it won't surprise him to learn that I strongly disagree with him on the first point. On the latter point, the issue of public accountability to the public is something that my honourable friend raised a moment ago, and is something that we've been thinking about with the senior leadership of the BBC and others as we approach the Charter review, and it's certainly something that I'd be happy to discuss with him.
Carla Lockhart.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last week we learned that the BBC upheld a complaint about their presenter Martine Croxall. Her alleged issue was that she correctly changed the wording of pregnant people to women. This is a scientific fact. Somehow the BBC found her eye roll as conveying a personal view. Madam Deputy Speaker, there are two genders, male and female, and one of those genders can become pregnant, women. This is the view of the Supreme Court. Would the Secretary of State therefore ensure that the BBC leadership abide by the court ruling, and would she agree that their lefty, woke agenda is certainly not in step with the majority of right-thinking people who want common sense at the core of broadcasting?
I don't agree with her characterisation of the BBC, and it is not, I'm sure most members would agree with me, that it is not for the Secretary of State to start writing editorial guidelines for the BBC on the floor of the House of Commons. That my job is, though, to work with the senior leadership to make sure that they have the right structures and people in place so that they have well thought through, easily understood and consistent editorial guidelines of the highest standard that are applied consistently and don't leave presenters and journalists struggling to interpret them.
Can I thank the Secretary of State for her answer? Point of order, Anna Sabine.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would just like to seek clarification on something. I think during the course of this debate, it's possible that the Secretary of State has given the impression that she doesn't have the power to remove BBC board members, whereas in fact the BBC Charter empowers her to remove anyone who is unable, unfit or unwilling to perform the functions of a member, and I seek your guidance about how to take this forward.
Can I thank the honourable member for her point of order? She will be aware that she had 2 minutes during the course of the urgent question to raise that, but I can see the Secretary of State wishes to respond. Secretary of State.
I would just like to make clear that I said to this House consistently, there is a very high legal threshold that must be met in order for board members to be removed. That is set out by the terms of the Charter, and as such I am unable to take the actions that a number of members of this House requested.
Point of order, Graham Downey.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last week, the member for Newark published a juvenile and shameful AI-edited videos of proceedings in this chamber. I have written to Mr Speaker about this matter and whether or not it's a breach of the terms and conditions of Parliament TV, which explicitly prohibit the altering of video or audio recording in any way. And I trust that is being fully investigated. More broadly, however, Madam Deputy Speaker, I am deeply concerned that while this video was obviously edited, the use of generative AI is fast evolving, and I believe this House must protect both itself and our wider democratic system by drawing a firm line in the sand. Attempts to edit words, gravitas and the responsibility of this place when members speak in this chamber is not acceptable, is disrespectful to colleagues and moreover an affront to democracy itself. can I ask you, Madam Deputy Speaker, what sanctions can currently be imposed on members of this House to deter and prevent this type of behaviour? And if they are not currently adequate, what more can be done to ensure our democracy is protected better in the future from this use of AI technology?
And I understand the member for Leighton and Wanstead wanted to raise a similar point of order. Calvin Bailey.
Deputy Speaker. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On the point of order, last week the Deputy Prime Minister made a historic appearance as the first black man in history to answer at Prime Minister question time, which would have been seen by thousands of young black men who would have believed that this is a place for them. Footage from that appearance has sadly been doctored for circulation on social media in violation of Parliament's rules on the use of footage, namely rules 1.2, 1.4 and 2.1, including a video shared from the account of the Right Honourable Member for Newark. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, would the Chair advise me how I and other honourable members can ensure that such flagrant breaches do not occur again?
Can I thank both members for their points of order and just seek clarification that the Right Honourable Member for Newark was informed in advance of the point of order. The terms and conditions for downloading and making use of clips from Parliament Live are published online. While it would not be appropriate for me to refer to guidance given to individual members, I would urge all colleagues to follow the rules. Ultimately, I am not responsible for what members post online. How we treat each other is important and sets the tone for national debate. I would ask members to consider carefully what is in good or bad taste and to exercise good judgment in what they post online about colleagues. On the broader point about the use of AI in relation to footage of our proceedings, that is an issue that the Administration Committee may wish to pursue. In particular, the House might benefit from considering whether the current licence, rules and enforcement mechanisms are appropriate. Point of order, Helen Maguire.
On a point of order, Madam Deputy Speaker, during my earlier remarks, I inadvertently stated that the Government had pledged £1.2 million towards the Strategic Health Alliance and UK-Ukraine trauma recovery. In fact, that sum has not yet been pledged. It is the amount that is sought and would make a real difference if provided. I apologise for any confusion caused, and while I have your permission, may I take this opportunity to once again urge the Government to consider making that commitment.
Can I thank the Honourable Lady for notice of her point of order and to note that she has put her correction on the record. Before we come to the 10-minute rule motion, I should inform the House that the Nathan Gill bribery case is still technically sub judice until sentencing on the 21st of November. However, given that the accused has pleaded guilty to the charges and the continuing interest from members on this case in the context of Russian interference with British politics, Mr. Speaker has granted a limited waiver to allow discussion of the case during today's proceedings. Members should avoid making reference to sentencing issues. 10-minute rule motion, Callum Miller.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to make provision about the seizure of frozen assets connected to the Russian Federation, to require the Secretary of State to publish recommendations about the use of such assets to fund military reconstruction and humanitarian work in Ukraine and for connected purposes. Madam Deputy Speaker, in November 2024, my constituent Alex wrote to me. Alex is a research scientist who has lived in the UK for over 25 years. Alex is Ukrainian. At a surgery, he told me how devastated and how angry he is about the destruction of his country by Russian invaders. He also told me of his fear for his brother, who is fighting on the front lines. Alex wanted to know why Ukraine was struggling to obtain the weapons it needed to resist Russian assaults. He asked me a simple question. What more can the UK do to help my brother and my country? The truth is, Madam Deputy Speaker, that in November 2024, there was more the UK could do. 12 months later, there is still more the UK can do. This bill sets out what the UK can do in one key area. Alex's story is one of tens of thousands just like it. We've all heard them from amazing Ukrainians who've been hosted by communities across the UK since Russia invaded. These stories speak to the horror inflicted by Vladimir Putin. The UN estimates that over 50,000 Ukrainian citizens have become casualties of Putin's war machine, including over 2,300 children wounded and over 700 killed. Tens of thousands of brave Ukrainian men and women have made the ultimate sacrifice on the front line. While some in this House, like the Honourable Member for Clacton, would prefer to be apologists for Putin, I know that I speak for most colleagues when I say that Putin alone is responsible for the atrocities we are witnessing in Ukraine. Yeah. Nor is Putin content merely to devastate Ukraine today. He is hell-bent on erasing its future. His systematic programme for the abduction of at least 20,000 Ukrainian children will go down as one of the vilest acts of this war. Yeah. I want to pay tribute to those colleagues who have shone a spotlight on this appalling crime. We must all commit ourselves to returning each and every Ukrainian child to their home. Yeah. Madam Deputy Speaker, Putin's ambitions stretch beyond Ukraine. In the Baltics, Russia poses an existential threat to our Lithuanian, Estonian and Latvian allies, all of whom face daily cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns. In the Caucasus, Putin's cronies and the Georgian Dream Party have cracked down violently on democracy activists, while the Kremlin's insidious efforts to distort elections in Moldova and Romania are well documented. Putin also wages a campaign of sabotage and cyber war across the rest of Europe, including here at home. Confirmation over the weekend that the RAF will now be deployed to defend Belgian airspace against Russian drone threats speaks to the collective nature of the threat we face. Putin's imperial ambitions are extensive. That is why we must be unwavering in our support to the Ukrainian people. The UK has stood shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine since the full-scale invasion. It was led by all three Prime Ministers in the previous government and has been sustained by the present government. Across that time with support from nearly all parties in this House, and we should be proud of that legacy. In providing weapons, equipment and fighter pilot training, we have helped keep Ukraine in the fight. Our leadership in G7 efforts to crack down on Russian oil revenues has been vital in cutting Putin's profits, although Liberal Democrats continue to call on the government to go further to ensure that no actors in the UK economy can facilitate the sale of Russian gas. We are also pushing the government to explain why over £30 million worth of Russian planes were imported to the UK last year. Madam Deputy Speaker, Britain's contribution has been crucial, but we cannot rest on those laurels. Rather, we must double down on our support. Last month, Ukraine's Defence Minister, Denis Shmyhal, laid out the challenge. He estimated that Ukraine will need to spend $120 billion on defence in 2026, of which Ukraine itself can cover half. That leaves a $60 billion hole, which Ukraine's allies have a duty to help fill. For many months, Liberal Democrats have called on the government to fund Ukraine's defence through seizing frozen Russian assets across the UK. The most recent estimates suggest that £300 billion worth of Russian assets are frozen across G7 countries, which includes close to £30 billion here in the UK. Seizing the UK-based assets could allow us to fill half of the projected deficit in Ukraine's required defence spend for next year, while ensuring that Putin and his cronies are the ones who pay. We could help turbocharge Ukraine's deep strike capabilities whilst bolstering the supply of air defence systems. In short, we could provide Ukraine with a vital new lifeline of support. So we find ourselves today at a critical point. Ukraine's need for finance is urgent. The UK's efforts to move the G7 and particularly EU allies have not yet resulted in success. At the same time, one very specific item allied to this topic highlights the frustrations felt by so many in this House. In May 2022, the Conservative government announced that they had, and I quote, agreed a deed of undertaking with Roman Abramovich. They said, again to quote, he committed the proceeds to a charity in a jurisdiction agreed by the government for the purposes of helping victims of the war in Ukraine. In common with other members, I have asked ministers about these funds. On the 24th of January, the 17th of March and the 21st of May, the Foreign Secretary and the Foreign Office Minister in his place told me that they were, to quote, redoubling our efforts, doing everything I can and working at pace. Yet still, over 3.5 years on, there is no progress towards releasing the £2.3 million, suggesting an alarming lack of either resolve or creativity from successive governments. Madam Deputy Speaker, I am keenly aware of the arguments raised against seizing Russia's frozen assets. The primary concern is that a direct seizure creates the possibility of litigious action by the Kremlin. The second is that by acting against Russia, we might inadvertently undermine wider confidence in the UK as a safe haven for financial assets. In response to the legal risks, the actions of the US in adopting the Repo Act and of Canada in adopting the CIMA Act demonstrate that other allies believe it is possible to legislate effectively to allow for asset seizures. And on the financial risks, I quote the previous Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, who said in March 2024, "I think that the economic case is very strong. Here we are in the City of London, one of the great financial centres of the world. I do not think that using that money will disadvantage us in any way." I am conscious too that these concerns have inspired important efforts in Brussels. These have aimed at securing Europe-wide agreement on proposals which would allow for the use of frozen assets, whilst reassuring Belgium in particular, where the majority of frozen assets are held, that the legal risk will be both reduced and shared. While I welcome these efforts at securing international consensus, those proposals have stalled. And with each day that passes without concrete action to unleash the potential of the assets, Putin's war machine makes further progress. Madam Deputy Speaker, last month we learnt that, shamefully, an elected UK MEP, Nathan Gill, took payment from a Russian agent, Olay Voloshin, to repeat pro-Russian propaganda in the European Parliament. Shame. Mr Gill sat in the European Parliament with party colleagues who now sit in this House. It is for the Honourable Member for Clacton to explain his meetings with Mr Voloshin's wife, and for the Honourable Member for Boston and Skegness to explain his public support for Mr Gill in 2019, and his more recent hospitality from Vladimir and Lyubov Chernukin. But I know that the overwhelming majority of colleagues in this House, just like the constituents we all represent, want us to provide the brave men and women of Ukraine with the funds they need to defend themselves. I am proud to present this bill on a cross-party basis and grateful to my co-sponsors and other members who have shown their support. Madam Deputy Speaker, 13 months later, I am still motivated by Alex's question. I am no longer prepared to tell him that it is very hard or that Belgium is cautious. This has become a question of will. The time for delay and timidity is over. I believe it is the will of this House to legislate so that the UK can lead our G7 and EU partners in seizing Russian state assets here in the UK and in making them available to Ukraine. Ukraine needs her friends to step forward with urgency and purpose. She needs our financial support today so that she can purchase the military material to drive back the Russians and defend her sovereign territory. And so, Madam Deputy Speaker, I urge the Government to show leadership towards our European and G7 allies and to work with colleagues from across the House to enact this bill.
Now, before I put the question, I would just like to confirm that the honourable member did in fact inform the members for Clacton and Boston and Skegness of his intention to refer to them. It would be a courtesy of the House, if he hasn't, for him to have done so in advance. The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
James McCleary, Monica Harding, Dr Al Pinkerton, Mike Martin, Richard Ford, Sir Ian Duncan-Smith, Stephen Gethin, Sir Julian Lewis, Alex Sobel and myself, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Callum Miller.
Russian frozen assets, seizure and aid to Ukraine bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 30th of January.
Friday the 30th of January. We now come to the general debate on remembrance and the contribution of the armed forces. Minister to move the motion.
I beg to move this House has considered remembrance and the contribution of the armed forces. On Sunday, His Majesty the King led the nation in commemorating generations of men and women who served, fought, and in many cases did not return home. Around 10,000 veterans gathered at the Cenotaph in Whitehall to observe the traditional 2-minute silence and take part in the Royal British Legion's Remembrance Sunday March Past. As a veteran myself, I was immensely proud to march as part of the Royal Marines Association. At memorials in towns, villages and cities right across the UK, civilians and members of the armed forces also came together to pay their respects of those who have made the ultimate sacrifice in all wars. Now, we owe everything to those heroes who laid down their lives to defend our shores, protect our interests, and safeguard our way of life. The peace and the freedom that we enjoy today is their precious legacy, and it's a reminder that freedom is not free. And Remembrance Day is the most important opportunity we have as a nation to come together and to honour them. Remembrance for me, and indeed I think many other veterans around the country, is about remembering the friends and the brothers in arms that we have lost. The specific moment when life was perhaps taken away, the gunfire, the explosion, the screaming, the chaos, the mud and the dust. And it is these heightened senses at a time of a traumatic event that are imprinted upon your memory. These memories are as vivid as the birth of your first child, a birthday, or any other impactful occasion, but they have very different meaning. Remembrance is about just that. It's the one day of the year where you are safe to remember, where memories surface and we pay collective tribute to those that are serving and indeed have served. It is also a very important time for this House, which has always had a special affinity for our armed forces and veterans. So it's an absolute privilege to lead today's debate, given my former role. Throughout the last year, it's been an honour to visit over 60 veterans' organisations and meet so many outstanding and absolutely selfless people. From the Veterans Community Hub in Lanarkshire to the Helping Homeless Veterans UK Hub in Bournemouth and across all the great nations of the United Kingdom, those individuals that dedicate their time to our armed forces community.
Minister, give way.
I will.
Catherine. I thank the Minister for giving way, and support for our veterans is so essential. I'm really proud that the British Legion in Derby is growing. Will he join me in wishing good luck to those who set up a new branch in Mackworth? And will he agree with me that this government's veteran strategy, including the £13.8 million to address homelessness, shows we're marching in step with those who campaign for veterans?
Minister.
I'd like to thank the honourable friend for her contribution, and definitely good luck to the RBL on expanding that portfolio. It's fantastic to see. And I hear Derby RBL have raised the most of any other RBL Derby within the country. Now, I'd very much like to state... let me finish this paragraph and then you can jump in. I would very much like to state on the record my personal thanks to the Royal British Legion and their work on the Poppy Appeal this year, and indeed for every year. I'm sure all colleagues across the House would echo this appreciation, and I very much look forward to hearing colleagues' contributions from across this House today. In 2025, it's been a really busy year for military anniversaries, particularly those associated with the final year of the Second World War. Now, in April, we marked 80 years since British troops swept across Northern Europe and liberated Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. We remember the horrors and atrocities that those soldiers witnessed firsthand, and the incredible work they carried out afterwards, burying the dead, containing the spread of disease, and caring for the survivors. Within a matter of weeks, Allied forces would be in Berlin, Hitler would be dead, and the communities across Britain would take to the streets to celebrate victory in Europe. On May the 8th of this year, we took to the streets again to celebrate VE Day's 80th anniversary and to pay tribute to all those who fought for democracy over tyranny, liberty over oppression, and human dignity over barbarism. Yet for some, VE Day did not mean the nightmare of World War II was over. British and Commonwealth troops in the Far East, who'd suffered some of the most gruelling and hostile environments of the entire conflict, still faced 3 months of fighting. The story of their war is one of almost superhuman strength and resilience. But then again, in August, we were able to remember their extraordinary contribution when we marked the 80th anniversary of victory in Japan Day, the day that finally brought the most catastrophic war in human history to an end. In September, we marked 85 years since Battle of Britain, when our aviators took on the might of the Luftwaffe, in a contest that not only determined control of our skies, but the fate of our entire nation. At a time of supreme enemy confidence, Britain proved to the world for the first time that Hitler and his forces could be defeated. Now, after such an important year for commemorations, today, Remembrance Day 2025, is a moment of profound national reflection and indeed gratitude, as we remember all those who served and indeed all those who have fallen. As we remember the conflicts gone by, the 107th anniversary of the 1918 armistice, which we remember those who fought in the Great War, those who served in the Korean War, which began 75 years ago, those who fought in Northern Ireland, the Falklands, Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere across the globe. Also those Commonwealth troops who made such a huge contribution to both world wars and other conflicts, and those who serve today and continue to uphold the values of courage, duty, professionalism, and indeed compassion, which have long distinguished British armed forces. And just as our forefathers fought for democracy, freedom, and the right to self-determination, so do, in the East, do our Ukrainian allies. So let us remember the heroism that Ukraine and Ukrainians are delivering today. Pitched in a battle of national survival, their war is no less bloody than that of World War II. And when we think about that conflict, it's worth recognising that the Russians have taken more casualties in that conflict than the Americans took in the entire Second World War. It gives you a statistical feel for the pain and suffering that that conflict has caused by Putin's war of aggression. So as we remember, we pay homage to all those fighting for the same values and ethics that we hold dear. And I'd also like to thank the many thousands of people from civilian and military backgrounds who have worked so hard to organise what were fantastic commemorations. Defence ministers have travelled the length and breadth of the UK on both sides of the benches, ministerial and opposition, whether it be the Royal Irish Regiment's annual Remembrance Service in Belfast, whether it be the Field of Remembrance in Cardiff, the Scottish National Remembrance Sunday event, the Remembering Afghanistan events at the National Memorial Arboretum, or indeed the War Widows Association annual service at the Cenotaph, and many, many others. These are just a tiny fraction of the many events up and down the country which have been possible by the tireless work of our armed forces and thousands of people in local communities. When the last survey was undertaken in 2018, it showed that 28,115 members of the Army alone attended Remembrance Day, parades at over 620 different events. And if not similar, it was probably more this year. Events are also being held worldwide, from Riga, where UK officials joined commemorations at the Jelgava Commonwealth War Graves site, to Senegal, where colleagues held an act of remembrance at the Bel Air Cemetery in Dakar. And as we discuss the role that our armed forces play in remembrance today, we must also consider the remarkable work that serving personnel perform all year round, educating young people about the history of defence, deterrence and warfare, promoting awareness and raising funds through charities, including through the Royal British Legion's incredible Poppy Appeal, and working with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission to maintain military graves to the highest possible standard all around the world. Today we thank them for their outstanding contribution. I will.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for giving way, and I won't take it personally in the interest of peace and togetherness that he chose the East Midlands over the West Midlands earlier. Madam Deputy Speaker, he should know better. But can I just thank the Minister, being from the West Midlands, but can I thank the Minister for his reference to young people, and will he join me in thanking all those young people I was with today at the Cenotaph in Newcastle Lyme this morning, from local schools who had their homemade poppies and wreaths, in whose hands our future and our commitment to democracy and to peace lie. And it is no more important responsibility on us as adults, as it were, to make sure that they are part of bringing our country together.
I'd like to thank the honourable friend for what is a really poignant contribution, and thank those in Newcastle under Lyme for making sure that awareness about the sacrifice is spread not just across the adult population but across the youth today. I always say that navies, armies, air forces don't win wars, industries, economies and societies do, and making sure society never forgets the past is absolutely critical.
I'm very grateful to the Minister. Can I say that there is no more appropriate member of this House to be introducing this debate today than the honourable gentleman with his distinguished record. I think I represent more generals than any other honourable or right honourable member of this House. He will have seen that 9 4-star officers wrote to the Times today, and they are concerned. They're concerned about the Northern Ireland Troubles Bill and the legal activism that it is likely to encourage. Quotes, they say, they risk weakening the moral foundations and operational effectiveness of the forces on which this nation depends. And whilst we all honour our brave servicemen and servicewomen today rhetorically, would he agree with me that we need to follow that through with real action to ensure that they are not disadvantaged today and into the future?
The honourable member makes an interesting point, and I want to be clear and concise. Today of all days is a day of remembrance. I don't think it's about political point scoring. We have a debate on Thursday where we can discuss this issue in detail, and I would very much welcome a discussion with those individuals that sent the letter, and as would the Defence Secretary and others, to talk through the issues and provide balance to the argument and ensure that we protect our country, our armed forces from lawfare, and ensure that they are represented and their voices are heard. Now, whilst I will give way.
I just want to return to this point about the commemoration. When I got elected back in 1992, I remember that having served before, we weren't allowed to wear uniforms in public because of the IRA threat at the time. And actually, bit by bit, these commemorations were no longer attended. I can remember my first commemoration in Chingford. I would be lucky if we had 100 people who turned out for that. Can I say to them how that has been reversed? One good example, on Sunday in my constituency at the memorial in Chingford, nearly 2,000 people turned up to commemorate those who have fallen and those who went before. Isn't that a very good example of how the next generation understands it sometimes better than my generation did?
What a welcome intervention. I was stewed with the veterans during the Cenotaph March Past, and it always astounds me that when you're stewed there with 10,000 people, and as the guns fire, there is complete silence in one of the busiest capitals in the world. And it's a sombre but hugely humble experience. And it's an absolute pleasure for me to see and hear all of the amazing stories of almost every constituency standing together, united around this great nation to celebrate those individuals that have served, are serving, and of course their families and the bereaved. So thank you for that intervention. Now, whilst we often focus on the individuals that have been lost, we must also remember those that were left behind. The mothers, the fathers, the brothers, sisters, partners, wives, and husbands who after one of those traumatic events all need to adapt to a new way of life. We need to remember them and remember them all, and acknowledge that whilst the loved ones perhaps paid the ultimate sacrifice, it's not just the individual that serves, but the whole family that serves, and they often suffer in silence long after the event. And then, I will.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way, and he's right to acknowledge not just the veterans, but those that have loved them. And today my son had the privilege of reading names at our local cenotaph of those that were killed in World War II. And also of my best friend, who was a Royal Marine, who died in 2012 in Afghanistan. And it was an incredibly proud moment for me that my son got to read his name and remember the sacrifice that those that have loved and lost made for us to live our lives. So thank you to the Minister for acknowledging those that have loved and lost.
Well, thank you for such a moving contribution. And may I say, in jest, you have a very good choice of best friends. And I know his memory will live long into the future. And it's a delight to hear that your son was taking part in that commemoration. Now, importantly, we must look after bereaved children. Madam Deputy Speaker, if you don't mind, I'd be delighted to highlight that following our little jaunt up Everest that we did earlier on this year, we've managed to raise £500,000, just under, for veterans' charities and the specific needs of bereaved children, which will go to help those loved ones across a whole plethora of different charities. Now, we show our eternal gratitude too for those families which have cared for members of our armed forces after returning from service, those who often bear the physical and mental scars of the conflicts that they've experienced. And I think the reason that this year's World War II commemorations were especially poignant was because they were likely the last major events to feature veterans from the war in any great numbers. Even the youngest of those veterans who graced the ceremonies in London are now well into their 10th decade. One of them, Mervyn Kirsch, 100 years old, who took part in the D-Day landings and then went on to Belsen a few weeks after it was liberated, laid a wreath at the cenotaph. And the whole House can be proud that he'll be watching PMQs tomorrow from the gallery. What an honour it will be to welcome him here. The living connection that Mervyn and his comrades provide to the war is a priceless asset, particularly at a time when the bloodiest European conflict since the Second World War continues to rage in Ukraine. They understand the cost of conflict because they lived through it, but they also understand that the privileges we inherited after the war, 80 years of peace, prosperity and freedom, can never, ever be taken for granted. We must be prepared to defend them in an increasingly dangerous world, and today a new generation of servicemen and women is doing precisely that. They are heirs to the veterans who proudly paraded on May the 8th, and they're guardians to that cherished inheritance. So today we also pay tribute to our serving men and women, working around the world to deter aggression, to safeguard British interests, and to stand shoulder and shoulder with our allies, showing Putin will not divide us. Now, you will note throughout this speech that there wasn't necessarily 1 ounce of politics within this debate. That could be called political naivety, but I call it a deep-found respect for those that have served and continue to serve, and welcome a debate and conversation on Thursday. This week's commemorations remind us once again of the unbreakable bonds linking our heroes from the past with the armed forces personnel of today, and those, indeed, who will serve in the future.
On that point,
I will.
Will my honourable friend join me in commemorating the work of Joshua Mullinger, an able Sea Cadet in York who played an integral role at York Service of Remembrance, and Conservative Councillor and Lord Mayor Martin Rowley, who he himself was a veteran? Would he join me in commemorating those very remarkable individuals?
Minister. I thank the honourable friend for his contribution. The cadets play such an important part, and the Sea Cadets right at the very forefront. To see Joshua thriving in that environment is absolutely superb, and to hear of Martin Rowley excelling after being in service is hugely admirable. I'd like to thank him for his service in particular. Now, as we remember the generations who have sacrificed so much, their testimony lives on, inspiring us to be strong in the face of adversity, to be resilient during difficult times, and to stand up for values that we believe in. That's the way we'll remember our military heroes best, and that's how we'll ensure their priceless legacy of peace and freedom will endure.
The question is that this House has considered remembrance and the contribution of the armed forces. Shadow Minister Mark Francois.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's also a privilege to open this debate for Her Majesty's opposition on the 11th of November, Armistice Day, a date on which the nation pauses and gives thanks for the sacrifice of our armed forces so that we can still live in a free country. It's a pleasure to follow on from the Minister for the Armed Forces, and I wish to endorse his comments about the value of our armed forces and the vital role that they play in the nation's contribution to remembrance. We all thank them for their service. The Minister rightfully also paid tribute to the operational role of our armed forces, who remain as vigilant as ever around the clock, keeping us safe in the 21st century. Nevertheless, perhaps you'll forgive me if in my contribution this evening I too also take something of a historical perspective on the vital role our armed forces have played in the defence of our nation down the years. I was privileged to attend the Royal British Legion Festival of Remembrance last Saturday evening, which remains as moving an occasion as when I first attended as an MOD minister over a decade ago. I should like to pay tribute this evening to the extremely valuable role that the Royal British Legion plays, both in shaping our whole concept of remembrance and also in supporting our veterans, some 2 million or so of whom are still living today. As well as the national commemorations, also including at the Cenotaph, the Royal British Legion, often supported by local armed forces personnel, also play a vital role in organising services at community level in all of our constituencies, up and down the length and breadth of the United Kingdom. While in my experience every community tends to do remembrance slightly differently to account for local circumstances, each ceremony has common elements with which we're all familiar. The emotive playing of the last post, the 2-minute silence, and usually also the famous epitaph from the 2nd Infantry Division Memorial, universally known as the Keyme epitaph, with those famous and stirring words: "When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow we gave our today." The Battle of Keyme, brilliantly described in Field Marshal the Viscount Slim's 1956 book, Defeat into Victory, arguably one of the best books ever written on the whole concept of generalship, was a classic example of a dogged defence by British and, crucially, also Commonwealth forces in stopping the attempted Japanese advance into India in mid-1944. Indeed, the dogged, stubborn defence, often against superior odds, is a recurrent feature of British military tradition. Be it the English archers at Agincourt, the Great Siege of Gibraltar, Wellington's army at Waterloo, the 24th Foot at Rorke's Drift, which saw the most Victoria Crosses, 11, ever awarded in a single action, the few of fighter command in the Battle of Britain, to whom the Minister also referred, the Royal Navy escorting the Atlantic convoys, or the glorious Gloucesters at the Imjin River in Korea, and many more besides, including more recently in the Middle East. There are, of course, many comparable examples from the First World War, not least the stand of the British Expeditionary Force at Mons or the subsequent First Battle of Ypres. For anyone who has stood at the Menin Gate, when the buglers of the Ypres Fire Brigade play the last post, as it swirls around that famous arch, it is a truly moving and emotive ceremony to behold. Nevertheless, yes, of course.
He's mentioned Bill Slim, who many who know his history will say was probably the greatest Allied general of the war. Brilliant what he achieved with next to nothing. But there was something very special about the 14th Army, which comes out in other accounts, and I don't know if he agrees with me, that apart from just fighting, the reality was that there were Indian members of the 14th and also British members. They served in the same slit trenches. They ran to aid each other, regardless of race or anything else. They delivered for each other. That was the most remarkable bit about the story of the 14th, was it didn't matter who you were, where you came from, you were as one against the tyranny of the Japanese.
I completely agree with my right honourable and gallant friend. The history of 14th Army is a proud one. It was a marvellous amalgam under a brilliant leader of people from countries and races around the entire Commonwealth who fought with one common aim, which was for freedom. They were sometimes called the Forgotten Army. They are not forgotten tonight. But I want to recall that after the horrors of the trenches and an understandable aversion to war in the 1920s, with Britain exhausted both financially and emotionally by the horrors of the Great War, the government of the day introduced what came to be known as the 10-year rule. This was not just the policy of the War Office or the Admiralty, as they then were, but was a pan-Whitehall edict, the essence of which was that Britain would not have to fight another major war for at least 10 years. This key planning assumption became the centrepiece of British strategic theory, and, with strong endorsement from the Treasury, the 10-year rule soon became a rolling one, extended on an annual basis. Given that no war was expected for at least a decade, this allowed for major economies in the financing of the armed forces and associated running down of all three services. as one example of how seriously the 10-year rule was taken and implemented. Even Winston Churchill, in his time as Chancellor of the Exchequer in the 1920s, exerted pressure to cut back on his beloved Royal Navy, the same service he had fought tenaciously to expand as First Lord of the Admiralty barely a decade before. Indeed, as a mood of pacifism gripped the nation, in 1933, the same year in which Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, the earnest students of the Oxford Union, who are having their own problems at the moment, passed a motion by a majority of over 2-1 that this House will under no circumstances fight for its king and country. The subsequent policy of appeasement among the 1930s British establishment, the blob of their day, was as erroneous then as it would be today. Authoritarian dictators tend to admire strength, particularly their own, and to despise weakness, a lesson that any British government, including this one, would do well to remember. History tells us again and again that the appeasement of dictators does not work, just as it failed to work in the 1930s. The 10-year rule, which by that stage had lasted well over a decade, was eventually only rescinded in 1935-6, as Britain began to rearm in response to Hitler's increasingly bellicose behaviour. Nevertheless, that rearmament and comparable action by our allies was ultimately insufficient to deter what then became the Second World War, a brutal conflict in which over 50 million people died, far more even than had perished in the supposed war to end all wars some 2 decades before. I mention all this, Madam Deputy Speaker, not just because I studied history, then military history at university, but because if, as members of this House believe, as I have always believed, the ultimate goal of our armed forces is to save lives by deterring war and persuading any potential aggressor that they could not prevail, then even today we need to ask ourselves, all of us, regardless of party, the question whether or not we are doing enough to secure the peace by maintaining sufficiently strong armed forces to provide such a vital deterrent effect. As a historical fact, twice in the last century, this country paid an immense cost in both blood and treasure to defeat militarism. Today, the threats are somewhat different, with a war on our doorstep in Europe following Russia's barbaric and illegal invasion of Ukraine. The Ukrainians are, in effect, now fighting for our freedom too, and we must back them to the hilt as a result. We also see a major rearmament by China. North Korea continues to develop even longer-range ICBMs, now with support from Russia, while Iran continues to exert malign influence across the Middle East, even after the successful American strike on its emerging nuclear capabilities. So the circumstances may have changed, but the principle remains exactly the same. We in the Western democracies cannot drop our guard against the growing powers of the 21st century autocracies, something those who fought in the Second World War would instinctively understand only too well. So whilst bearing in mind the Minister's caution, I was genuinely concerned to read one passage of the government's recent Strategic Defence Review, its seminal defence policy document, where on page 43, under the heading of Transforming UK Warfighting, the document states this: "This review charts a new era for defence, restoring the UK's ability to deter, fight and win with allies against states with advanced military forces by 2035. I say to the Minister, in all sincerity, there seems there to be an echo of the 10-year rule of the 1920s. Whilst there was a great deal of good in the SDR, not least the intention to speed up our highly bureaucratic procurement system, about which the Minister knows I've always held firm views, I nevertheless do worry, given increasing threats from Russia and now also from China, whether the Ministry of Defence today displays the genuine sense of urgency that is required to meet the challenges which we now all clearly face. Now, before I'm accused of selective quoting, within the same paragraph of the SDR, it does go on to say, this vision could be achieved more quickly, should circumstances demand it, and should more resources be made available. Notwithstanding those words, with much of the new money in the SDR unavailable for at least 2 years, and a multi-billion-pound programme of in-year efficiency savings now underway, I merely ask, have we really learned the lessons of the past century as well as we might? In conclusion, we in these islands have always, ultimately, been prepared to make great sacrifices to uphold the freedom of Europe, and indeed of the wider world itself. That's why, given our history, we should never forget that the first duty of government remains the defence of the realm. In response to the philosopher Edmund Burke's famous challenge that all that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing, twice in the last century, our own good men and women across the nation stood up to and defeated such evil. In a moment, with our armed forces in the lead, a sacrifice which we rightfully, solemnly remember each and every November, including in this House tonight. I'll gladly give way.
Thank the Shadow Minister. And while we're celebrating and remembering, we talk of the greatest generation, we also have the ability tonight and the potential to build our young people into being the best generation. And perhaps maybe we should be focusing upon that as well, looking back but looking forward. I think the Minister said that. And I think what we must try and do as well is there is a generation of young people proud to be British, proud to stand against repression, proud to undertake to be inclusive. Would the Honourable Gentleman agree that's what we need to build for?
As a young person myself, Madam Deputy Speaker, having recently turned 60, I would like to say in all seriousness that I too, at the remembrance services that I was at this weekend, I'm sure like many honourable members and right honourable members across the House, was really struck by the number of young people, people from the Cubs and the Scouts, the Brownies and others who attended those services and often participated and laid tributes and wreaths and crosses of their own. I took great heart from that, and I believe there is hope yet. I wish to conclude, but I would just say there would be no greater betrayal of the sacrifices that we have been debating this evening than if we, as a House, with all the other matters that we have to consider, somehow became so distracted or complacent that we failed to act with sufficient clarity of purpose and determination to deter a future major conflict, perhaps even a global one, from breaking out again in our lifetimes. Or to put it perhaps another way, we must now conduct ourselves in our today in such a way as to never risk the security of our tomorrow. With that sincere warning, I pay tribute to our valiant armed forces, both past and present, and everything they do, day in and day out, to keep us and our country safe and free, lest we forget.
Before I call the Chair of the Defence Select Committee, there will be a 5-minute time limit imposed after the Liberal Democrats spokesperson. Tamanjit Singh Desi.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And as Chair, on behalf of the whole House of Commons Defence Committee, I want to express our deepest gratitude to all those who have served our country